The transatlantic slave trade, spanning from the 16th to the 19th centuries, was one of the darkest chapters in human history. This brutal system of human trafficking forcibly transported millions of Africans to the Americas, subjecting them to unimaginable cruelty and dehumanization. The sheer horror of slavery led many enslaved Africans to choose death over a life of bondage. This article explores the harrowing decisions faced by these individuals, their acts of resistance, and the enduring impact of their choices on our understanding of the transatlantic slave trade. The transatlantic slave trade involved the capture, sale, and transportation of Africans to the Americas, where they were sold into slavery. European traders, with the complicity of African intermediaries, captured or bought individuals from various regions of Africa. These captives were then packed into slave ships under inhumane conditions for the Middle Passage, a horrific journey across the Atlantic Ocean. Upon arrival in the Americas, they were sold at auctions and forced into labor on plantations, in mines, and in households. The scale of the transatlantic slave trade was staggering. It is estimated that between 12 and 15 million Africans were forcibly transported to the Americas. The conditions they endured were brutal, with many succumbing to disease, malnutrition, and abuse during the voyage. Those who survived the Middle Passage faced a life of hard labor, severe punishment, and complete deprivation of basic human rights. For the enslaved, life was characterized by relentless toil, violence, and a complete lack of autonomy. Families were often torn apart, with members sold to different owners and locations. Enslaved individuals were subjected to physical and psychological abuse, with brutal punishments meted out for even minor infractions. The threat of violence was omnipresent, and enslaved people lived in constant fear of whipping, mutilation, and death. The dehumanizing nature of slavery stripped individuals of their identities, reducing them to mere property. Enslaved people were denied education, freedom of movement, and the right to form legal marriages. Their very existence was dictated by the whims of their owners, who viewed them as expendable labor. The hopelessness and despair engendered by such conditions led many enslaved individuals to see death as the only escape from their suffering. Throughout the history of the transatlantic slave trade, there are numerous accounts of enslaved Africans choosing death over the torment of slavery. These acts of defiance took various forms, including mass suicides, infanticide, and individual acts of self-destruction. These tragic choices reflect the profound desperation and the refusal of many Africans to accept a life of bondage. One of the most poignant examples of mass suicide occurred aboard slave ships during the Middle Passage. Enslaved Africans, often shackled together, would sometimes coordinate to jump overboard, choosing to drown rather than endure the horrors that awaited them. These acts were not only a means of escaping their captors, but also a powerful assertion of their agency in the face of total dehumanization. The case of the Portuguese slave ship São José, which sank off the coast of South Africa in 1794, is a notable example. In the chaos of the sinking ship, many enslaved Africans chose to remain chained below decks, preferring death to the possibility of continued enslavement. Similar incidents were recorded on other slave ships, highlighting a recurring pattern of resistance through self-destruction. For enslaved women, the decision to kill their own children was a particularly heartbreaking form of resistance. Infanticide was seen as a way to spare their children from a life of suffering and degradation. By ending their children's lives, these mothers sought to protect them from the horrors of slavery that they themselves endured. The story of Margaret Garner, an enslaved woman in the United States, is a powerful example. In 1856, faced with the imminent capture of her and her children by slave catchers, Garner killed her young daughter rather than see her return to a life of slavery. This tragic act of defiance underscored the extreme measures some enslaved women were willing to take to shield their children from the cruelties of bondage. Individual acts of suicide among enslaved Africans were also common. These acts were driven by the unbearable conditions of slavery and the desire to reclaim some measure of control over their own lives. Enslaved people used various methods, including hanging, poisoning, and self-inflicted wounds, to end their suffering. In the Caribbean, where the harsh conditions of sugar plantations were particularly brutal, suicide was a frequent response to the relentless exploitation. Enslaved individuals in Jamaica, for example, often resorted to poisoning themselves with the poisonous plant manchineel. These acts of self-destruction were a final, desperate bid for freedom from the physical and psychological torment of slavery. The decisions of enslaved Africans to choose death over slavery had profound implications for the understanding of resistance in the human spirit. These acts of defiance challenged the narratives of enslaved people as passive victims, highlighting their agency and determination to resist dehumanization. They also served as a stark indictment of the brutality of the transatlantic slave trade and the systems of oppression that sustained it. The legacy of these acts of resistance continues to resonate today. They remind us of the extreme conditions faced by enslaved people and the lengths to which they would go to assert their humanity. The stories of those who chose death over slavery are a testament to the resilience and courage of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity.